Good morning and welcome to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger Green, and this is a video that it kind of doubles for some of my university courses because I'm teaching race and power in U.S. history right now. But I'm also running a seminar in a local bookstore called Matter Books, and uh, my first lecture delivery for that seminar is on my Patreon account. And so I'm making this for my Patreon subscribers, especially. Although certainly folks who are interested in the topic of slave codes might uh, be especially interested in this as well. So for those of you who have listened to lecture one from the seminar, I opened with a long passage critiquing liberalism from the writer Saidiya Hartman and her famous book, Scenes of Subjection. But I tied it into neoliberalism and all sorts of other things and gender issues, all the way down to transgender issues. And that's because when I made that video that week, the Trump inauguration seemed to particularly being attacking of transgender folks, right? So my point there, and what I will elaborate here and over several lectures, is to think about the ways that gendering or degendering in some cases and racial oppression are sort of operating as two sides of the same coin. We could throw class in there as well, and that's an important level of analysis for sure. But uh, I think what in terms of the current sort of political moment, and what I see as a particularly virulent attack, like so much unchecked animosity toward people whose genders may be in some sort of way opaque or ambiguous, tapping that back into a much longer history. Um, so while there are instances in early American history of female husbands, right? So that's an interesting phenomenon that we might address in a later talk. This talk is going to focus on the development of slavery and slave codes, but also give us a little bit of nuance about the ways that modern racism develops out of earlier religious othering, right? So there was a Doctrine of Discovery video between my my first seminar video talking about papal bulls, and I've talked about this in multiple videos, but on my Patreon page you can follow along and see where my thinking is at. And so this is building on some of that Doctrine of Discovery stuff. What we see, generally speaking, is that the development of whiteness as a legal concept, especially, and a racial concept, the legislation around race is something that is slowly emergent throughout the 1600s, particularly on the east coast of what is now the United States, or Turtle Island, if we want to use an indigenous name. And it's in that context of the colonies, particularly English colonies, that we get definitely like more of this kind of skin color, epidermic racism, modern racism, chattel slavery will come out of this, which is quite different than ancient forms of slavery. So, as a way in here, some of my students have read or are reading the 1619 Project. Uh, it's controversial. Like, there's nothing that's not controversial about like all of the stuff that I'm talking about. But it's because it's like a big name book from the New York Times. It's received all sorts of attention. There are generally good things about it. There are flaws with it that I have, like in terms of scholarship with respect to a lack of attention to indigenous issues, like I just said. But like we already have that earlier. lecture on Doctrine of Discovery issues, and we'll see my attention to indigenous issues kind of hopefully balances out a little bit. But in terms of the content of the actual book, which has a whole lot of writers and a whole lot of really, really great essays, I still find that it's a good book. And it's a good way in for people. Not there's never going to be one book that is like your silver bullet for understanding everything. So I'll refer to a lot of them. When I'm referring to books, I'm just being generous and giving people places to look. But we live in such anti-intellectual times that people get defensive, like, oh, too many books. He's just citing other scholars, oh blah blah. Um, the editors, Nicole Hannah-Jones is the main editor here, or the and creator, as they say on the cover. The editors tell us they give these dates of events that happen, and then they've got essays and they've got poetic reflections and things like that that are really nice in terms of this way of telling a historical narrative. So the editors tell us that in December of 1662, Virginia's House of Burgesses passes a new law holding that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother. Uh, this doctrine, known as partus sequitur ventrum, that which is brought forth through the belly, is a departure from English tradition in which a child's status followed that of the father. The law incentivizes the rape of enslaved black women by their white enslavers. That is true. That's one date. Let me give you another date, another act, and then we'll fill in some of this stuff in the lecture. In 1682, they say Virginia's House of Burgesses makes interracial marriage punishable by imprisonment. Over the next decade, Virginia and other colonies continued to pass laws restricting and prohibiting marriage between the white and black people. No such laws in England exist in England at that time. They are unique to the North American colonies and help to create a racial caste system that strictly forbids interracial relationships of all kinds. Um, and then there are other essays in here that you're welcome to look at on your own, but I'm gonna dig into some other things. So I've got a PowerPoint made. I'm gonna pull it up here, share my screen, enter into a slideshow from the start, move my face out of the way. uh, from religious othering to racial othering, the making of modern race. Center for Critical Theory. I also teach over at MSU Denver. At least this semester I do as a part-time employee over there. So when we think about whiteness, there's a whole field of academic study these days called whiteness studies. And a big name is David Roediger. He has a book that I have here called Wages of Whiteness, Race in the Making of American Working Class. I found it a very helpful book. In this book, he says, quote, the term white arose as a designation for European explorers, traders, and settlers who came into contact with Africans and indigenous people of the Americas. As such, it appeared even before permanent British settlement in North America. Its early usages in America served as much to distinguish European settlers from Native Americans as to distinguish Africans from Europeans. Thus, the prehistory of the white worker begins in the settlers' images of Native Americans. The important takeaway from the beginning here is that concepts of race are historically and materially based. They are not static and transcendent and exist over time. And oftentimes the ways people talk about it in like on the streets is like, oh, white people or white this or are people of color or black people, they tend to create a static and transcendent category with little to no reflection on the fact that we can trace these things historically, or they will do things, and this tends to happen from conservative-minded people a lot. It's like, oh, well, racial oppression has always existed. People have always been equal. When are we going to solve it? We're never going to solve it. Where things are so much better now in this country than they've ever been before. So I don't know what you're all complaining about. So that kind of tactic is like, oh, like we can't do anything because there's been inequality since time immemorial for all of human history. Like, so people want to avoid the specific historical nuance by either making essentializing and making a static and transcendent sort of concept, or they want to take this other tack where everything is so generalized that there's no reason to look to nuance and to do critical thinking. Those are both problems. Now, within the kind of uh, um, I don't like to use the term for various reasons, but I'm going to and stress the quotation marks here in the sort of quote woke community that the current right-wing regimes really, really hate and vilify. Um, uh, there has been a kind of uh, co-optation of inclusivist principles by what I will call neoliberal governmentality. Refer to some of my earlier lectures on that. What I mean is that identity categories have become uh, so rigidified in our cookies feeds and our market-based sensibility that takes all of our lives and makes them into um, uh, like kind of like we're treating our own existence like stock portfolios and looking for investors. That same kind of phenomenon falls back into our identity categories, and it might be race, it might be sexual orientation, it might be gender expression, or it might be class, right? It might be nationality as well. All of those sort of categories can be it can be useful to be critical and to understand like what the difference is between like a black feminist and a national organization of women feminists from the 1980s, which we will talk about in different lectures. So we need to have critical attention, but we can't like go into the way of rigidity and just saying like, well, because of the way that the person in front of me seems to identify or seems to present, or the way that I perceive them to present, or they're not like me in some sort of way, playing this like liberal politics of recognition game, that becomes a problem too, right? Like one of my colleagues was complaining yesterday about um, working with students and about like bringing a campus speaker to campus. And before the topic was even chosen, before the theme was even chosen, it was like, well, we want a person that is of this race or this gender or this sexual orientation, that kind of thing. So it's like a little bit of putting the categories that very much do, need to be attended to in terms of being more inclusive, putting that ahead of the content, right? Of whatever somebody's going to say or come to talk about. Um, um, my suggestion might be that like if that's a really important thing, maybe have somebody to come to talk about their identity or something like that. So yeah, we need to have some sort of flexibility. And I think that things have gotten so rigid in terms of left politics in the United States, which is like so not as far left as other places in the world, that there's a kind of um, identity politics makes it hard for people to put together an agenda, and that's probably one of the reasons why right wing and fascist impulses win currently, because uh, people tend to be overly not. I don't like to use the term divisive in the way that the right wing, like, oh, you liberals or you leftists, they're always divisive, sort of thing. We have to have critical thinking, we have to have critical theory. What critical theory does is it looks at the level of society, not at the level of the individual. But we live in a time right now where neoliberalism has made us into beings who focus on our identities first. I say this, blah, 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 blah. Before I say anything, let me draw attention to my embodiment, blah, 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 blah. That kind of thing is not really what the critical theory project is. You might have fun doing that on your own. So when we're talking about whiteness, and when we look at these ideas, what we see as whiteness is an emergent concept that becomes part of a legal system in the 17th century, and where the word and the term white increasingly replaces the word and the term Christian. Care to carry on here. Um, There's a two-volume study on the invention of the white race by Theodore Allen. Great book. I got the cover there, but and Allen traces the in the first volume. It's kind of like earlier times, and the second volume brings us up into to more present times. Allen stresses, this is from volume two here, um, that the early emergent concepts of white race developed alongside the colonizing of Ireland and the establishment of social control. So the flip side to Irish was, of course, quote, English or Anglo-Saxon, although England had been colonizing Ireland since the 1100s. After 1534, when England breaks away from the Catholic Church and creates the Anglican Church or state religion there, a version of Protestantism, with when they break with the Catholic Church, the primary distinction between English and Irish became more overtly religious, so Protestant versus Catholic. And you can see that all the way into the 21st century in terms of Northern Ireland and uh, Ireland proper, Ireland, which emerged from the Ulster plantation way back when, and that was always the kind of British or English foothold in on that part of the island, right, versus the predominantly Catholic part of the rest of Ireland. Irish Catholics who come to the United States largely in the wake of the potato famine, which it has to do with class issues over in Ireland in the 1840s. Millions of folks who are Irish Catholic enter into the upper East Coast of the United States, especially in places like Boston, right? But at that particular time, Irish Catholics were not considered to be white, despite the color of their skin. So whiteness and concepts of whiteness change after Reconstruction, after the emancipation of slaves. All of a sudden, lower class white folks are being included in a concept of whiteness. And that is the pattern that we see. What we see is when there is any kind of cohesion and solidarity between African slaves early on or native folks and white colonists, when there is solidarity, the ruling class comes in and invents ways to divide them. And one of the patterns is that for poor white people, they get some sort of status, whether it's whiteness or Christian, they're different forms. It creates a way for them to think of themselves as better and disidentify with the struggles of of people who are determined to be non-white. And so that's where this category of whiteness that eventually becomes the kind of white supremacy, not in like the Nazi overt way, but the white supremacy that founds the nation state. The kind of white supremacy that says in the 1790 law, if you think I'm like being picking on the United States and I'm unpatriotic, like one of our first, immigration laws in 1790 says that only white people can immigrate to the United States and become citizens in the United States. One particularly, it's gendered too, but they're saying that they're defining citizenship in terms of adult white men. Currently today, there's this debate going on from the Trump administration because I'm making this video in 2025 about like contestation of birthright citizenship, right? If we think back historically and we look at the foundations of the country and the ways that citizenship is being defined, it's being defined overtly in terms of whiteness. And so that's what I mean when I say white supremacy there. Um, so Theodore Allen says racism based on skin color emerged in the American colonies with the institution of white race system of social control, the key necessity of preserving, quote, white skin privileges of laboring class European Americans vis-a-vis or by way of all or against all non-Europeans. Continue on with my slides here. From volume one of Allen's study, he says, quote, in contrast to the British West Indies, the social control problem in the continental plantation colonies was not that there were too few American laborers, but that there were too many. It was this circumstance that accounted for the decisive role of, quote, race, which came to characterize the system of social control in the continental colonies. Primary emphasis on race became the pattern only where the bourgeoisie could not form its social control apparatus without the inclusion of the propertyless European Americans. I think he's totally right on track with that assessment. He does use the term bourgeoisie there, which comes from a Marxian analysis of class and society, and Marx is writing that kind of stuff in the late 1800s. So, just to be technically speaking, even according to Marx's analysis, in this early modern era, the bourgeoisie is still sort of forming as a sort of class. Uh, we're seeing the dregs or the leftover moments of feudalism and slavery. And part of that system is where this kind of bond servant, indentured servant kind of attitude is coming from as well. So just want to like be a little bit clearer on that use of the term bourgeoisie. Allen, this is in Allen's book, but Allen points to the scholarship of Edward Morgan, and, who's noted that, quote, as Christian whites, even the unproperty European Americans, including bond laborers, were offered a number of benefits previously denied to them in order to alienate them from their African American fellow bondsmen and bondswomen. And so what we're talking about here is that like this notion of being Christian on top of being a Christian white, right, is something that becomes a status of a privilege, something that gives one a privileged kind of status, especially in relation to other bonds people, right? And especially in relation to Native people who at least first off, are not Christian at all. But we get, even as some Native people convert to Christianity or some Africans convert to Christianity, we get this more and more of a distinction of whiteness as separating out from religion. So carry on here. In Virginia colonial law, and I've got a link here, you can look it up on archive.org. Um, we see that while there are earlier instances in emergent colonial laws, especially I would say in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which I'll get to in a second, a typical example of emergent color consciousness language can be seen in the following passage, which lumps all, quote, Indians into one category. We know that that's a misnomer, right? We know that that's Columbus's term because he thinks he's in India, and it becomes a more and more a racialized term. But there's like, so there's no distinction between, if you use the term Indian, there's no distinction between Wampanoag, Narragansett, um, uh, uh, any of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Tuscarora, Onondaga, Seneca, Cayuga, Mohawk, Mohegan, Powhatan down in Virginia, if I'm going to go down to Virginia. The term Indian just lumps all sorts of people together in the same way that the term Negro, as it was being used with respect to Africa, lumps all sorts of indigenous peoples into one category that increasingly becomes racialized, right? It's a fictionalized category that creates a social imaginary in the minds of all people, but especially is being manipulated by the ruling classes. So the terms Englishman and white in Virginia colonial law are used interchangeably, mostly by the editor of William Waller Henning, who's compiling these documents in the early 1700s. Now, if you're looking at my screen, you see that I'm using lowercase stuff. That's all intentional here, and some of this material is coming from my forthcoming book with Dr. Tink Tinker, who's a Wasatch Osage guy. And we are very attentive to the ways that we use capitalization. So I'm not neglecting this. One of my PhDs is in English for the other one's in religious studies. When we look back to earlier colonial documents, you can see capitalization is all over the place too. So it's about historical mindedness, among other things. So William Walter Henning, who compiles the documents in the early 1700s, is kind of using those terms interchangeably. In Act 7 of the Charles II statutes from October 1665, we see a broadening of legal application to all Indians, updating previous statutes against groups of particularly Northern Indians. So this is a direct quote. This grand assembly have thought it fit to enact and be it enacted that the said law be made a general law against all Indians whatsoever, and where any murderers or murders be committed upon the English, the next town is to use all their care and diligence in finding the doers and actors of the said murders. So it's connecting regions like one town to the next for crimes of somewhere else. So it's like it's creating a kind of municipality within a region and bringing it under one particular colonial control. Um, and be it further enacted that if any English man is murdered, the next town shall be answerable for it with their lives or liberties to the town and the town answer use of the public, and that the right honorable the governor be humbly requested forthwith to empower such persons as his honor shall think fit in each county on such occasions for putting the said law into immediate execution, and that it be made known to all Indians whatsoever by these persons so commissionated within 2 months after the said law is in force. So, especially as it's addressing native peoples or Indians, like the next town over must be helpful in seeking out people who have murdered some Englishmen in another town, and they will be held accountable as well in another town, right? So it's lumping all of the Indians into one particular category, all of the different separate nations like Wampanoag, Narragansett, etc. Um, Creating the category of Indian, and then uh, making the crimes that happen in one place, making the town or villages in other places responsible for it, the next one over. So we see this expansive kind of mentality going on with the colonial endeavor here. Um, be it further enacted by this grand assembly that the said Indians shall not have power within themselves to elect or constitute their own werowance or chief, for sachem, for example, commander, but the present honorable governor and his successors from time to time shall constitute and authorize such person in whose fidelity they might find the greatest cause to repose a confidence to become the commander of their respective towns. And in the case of Indians, shall refuse their obedience to or murder such a person, then that nation of Indians, so refusing or offending to be accompted enemies and rebels and to be proceeded against accordingly. So basically, like the English governor can from time to time deputize certain native folks according to English conceptions of power and law, and not according to the cultural titles of something like sachem or werowance that are happening within the indigenous gift exchange economy. That of course the early colonists and these colonists are still participating in relationship to that as well. This is going to be the backdrop that sets up the instances that create so-called King Philip's or Metacom's War in the 1670s. This act is from October of 1665, and we want to think back historically a little bit to what's going on in England. It's Charles II. He's come back into power with the return of the monarchy around 1660. And then in early 1662, we get those laws that I quoted from the beginning of the text, but they are reflecting a different sort of slave code that has been introduced in Barbados. So the first slave code is that we'll get to in another slide here, comes from Barbados, and we start seeing the other English colonies, Jamaica, and then the east coast of Turtle Island colonies end up adopting those slave codes as well. But you want to think back like this kind of there's a new regime back in England that's behind some of this stuff as well. When we think back further in terms of the formation of race and modern forms of racial oppression and slavery, Willie James Jennings, the Christian theologian, notes with respect to African slaves that we can imagine it in terms of a displacement that's two pronged, like a fork, right? First is the kidnapping and removal of Africans, especially from the interior of Africa. But then it quickly is relegated to a specifically and theologically Christian view of the world. So Jennings also points to a scale of black and white that was emergent in the 1400s, but not initially the hierarchy of races or later biological conceptions of races. So you start seeing this kind of othering, a noticing of skin color, kidnapping of people, putting them into a theologically Christian particular world. And then from that, we see this kind of hierarchy of the races emerge after that. So this is again from Christian othering to racial othering, as my lecture is titled here today. So when we look back to 1656, this is well, before the restoration of the monarchy over in England. We look. Theodore Allen notes that in 1656, in a case in Virginia, where an African American woman named Elizabeth Key, who successfully sued to be removed from slavery on the grounds that she had converted to Christianity, right? This is like evidence to support my argument. It's Christianity othering first before it's racializing othering. So here we have an African woman, African American, because she's been living here, although that's a weird term to call it. I mean, Jesse Jackson is the one who really makes that comes up with that term in the 20th century. Um, this woman, Elizabeth Key. Um, uh, she sues because she says, I've converted to Christianity and therefore I shouldn't be enslaved anymore. So by 1667, after the new slave codes have come in from Barbados, the Virginia Assembly cut the knot wherein freedom was tangled with conversion to Christianity, right? They enacted a law providing that, quote, the conferring of baptism doth not alter the condition of the person as to his bondage or freedom. Thus, the Anglo-American bourgeoisie had found a way to have the best of both the sacred and the profane spheres. The best of the sacred was gained in the new gospel that reconciled English liberties to slavery, the best of the profane by ensuring against legal challenges made on religious grounds against holding lifetime hereditary bond laborers. So it comes no surprise, Theodore Allen claims, that, quote, at the threshold of the 18th century, it was Virginia that led the way among Anglo-American continental colonies in codifying the concept of race, not class, as being the great distinction in society. Allen's citation at this particular his book place in his book comes from uh, Lion G. Tyler, who's reviewing a Philip Alexander Bruce piece of writing called The Social Life of Virginia in the 17th Century. William and Mary Quarterly from 1907 to 1908. So just like being attentive that when we're looking at historians and we want to look up their sources and what they're citing and these are and where are they getting this information these days on the internet because like Alan's book is a little bit old here if you want to know more about the Elizabeth Key case you can I've got a link here for you to look at as well. So if we want to look at slave codes by date, just to get a sense of the history here, Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Puritans up there, they are in 1641, Massachusetts Bay Colony body of liberties legalized slavery in the slave trade. So this was the first legal code in North America to legal to make enslavement legal. It's not that slavery didn't exist before then, but it's like it's wrapped up in indentured servitude and bonds service. So what slavery does is it introduces a condition of lifelong slavery and where if we're going to go with like after 1662 where the heritage or the lineage is being traced through the mother's body then any baby born to an African mother in perpetual slavery will also be in perpetual slavery and contrary to what I mean, not exactly contrary, but like just in addition to what was said in the 1619 project, it does if a African woman gets pregnant, it doesn't matter if it's from a white so-called master or if it's from another slave, right? So, and this is why I think that when we see Black feminist writers like Hortense Spillers in Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, it's a very famous essay from the 1980s when she talks about the degendering of African slaves, both men and women, in the Middle Passage. There's a degendering that happens with the shift of the black body to becoming a fungible commodity, a market-based commodity. So again, I would point us back to Willie James Jennings and his book, The Christian Imagination, because that's a really good account of the earlier slavery situation even before Columbus, right? The early African slave trade, and how it's wrapped up within ideas of Christianity, and then it eventually over time becomes the modern racial hierarchy. So there are other New England slave colonies, of course, or other New England colonies. And so by 1670, other New England colonies had adopted the model of hereditary and permanent enslavement of Black people. So slaves codes, the results of this is that the slave codes restrict the social, economic, and political autonomy of enslaved people. Really, what Orlando Patterson calls in his book that has this in the title slavery is a kind of social death. That's a good way of thinking about what that is. You might think of like a conventional society, but like in just as degendering happens with respect to both um, African and African men and women, as their bodies become the central commodity object, um, the same thing happens with the rest of any kind of like notion that Euro-Christians might call rights, even natural rights, which is a Christian an idea from the Christian philosophical tradition. So slave codes made it illegal to teach enslaved people to read. Slave codes controlled the growth of free African population. Slavery was not officially ended in Massachusetts until 1783 with the American Revolution, but of course the southern states took slave codes and implemented them within their new constitutions and new state legislatures, right? At the founding of the United States. And then the Constitution creates the three-fifths clause. And so that the problem of slavery is not solved at the foundation of the United States, comes back to bite them in the butt in the Civil War, and we're still dealing with the fallout of it today. When we turn back to earlier slave codes or systematic slave codes, of course, the Spanish have been colonizing both of the continents, northern and southern, since the late 1400s, right? So in Spanish laws of the Indies, they define the treatment of slaves and Indios from contact to arrival of the English. The first attempted English colony is in 1580s, right? The Roanoke colony, but that doesn't last. So the first permanent um, English colony, of course, is 1607 Jamestown. Um, and so uh, that's quite a bit later. There's a like from the Euro-Christian perspective, right? It's the Spanish laws and to a certain extent Portuguese laws further south down into Brazil. In 1661, we get the Barbados slave codes being developed. In 1662, we see that being implemented over into um, some of the Virginia codes that we saw earlier on. 1664, Jamaica adopts and modifies the Barbados codes, then significantly adds or expands them in 1684. In 1685, we get the French Code Noir, which has more of a Catholic tinge again and is anti-Protestant. And I can't go into it in this lecture, but I think I just want to note that it's there. So it doesn't like the Christian base, whether Catholic or Protestant, lies beneath racialization. It's closer to worldview in my other lectures, right? So racialization becomes an ideological formation um, that emerges out of different Euro-Christian countries or nations, whether they have different cultures, different languages, and even different theological positions. It is the previous base that we saw in the Doctrine of Discovery that creates the or exemplifies the Euro-Christian worldview, right? All lowercase, one word Euro-Christian. I'm not talking about faith, which is, or like faith alone, which is a kind of Protestant idea of religion. I'm talking about a worldview from which various Europeans came and that underlies all of them as they approach colonization of the continents and the treatment of natives and eventually the emergence of modern forms of race. 1691, we see that South Carolina copies Jamaican codes and then reasserts them again, especially following in 1740, following a the Steno rebellion. I have a slide on the next slide. We'll look at that rebellion. So whenever there's an uprising, there's more of an increase in implementation of slave codes. In 1702, we see New York slave codes. Of course, it's New Amsterdam before that, and they have they're part of this emergent process. But I'm not taking so much of that international approach in this lecture. Um, 1650 or 1755, we see Georgia adopting South Carolina's codes. For my students, just to let you know, for Virginia, of course, is named after the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth. And then we get the Carolina colonies. They're named after the Charleses, the King Charleses, first and second. And then we see Georgia, because the king in the 1700s, there are several King Georges in the 1700s, and that the Georgia colony shows up, right? So all of those colonies that later become U.S. states are being named after English monarchs. South Carolina's codes go on to inform most of the incoming colonies, and the codes are generally adopted by new states' constitutions after the American Revolution. I mentioned the Stono Rebellion in September of 1739. Here we see the largest slave rebellion in the British mainland colonies before the American Revolution. The rebellion began on the banks of the Stono River, about 20 miles southwest of Charleston. The rebels broke into a store and stole guns and powder. They called for their freedom and headed south towards Spanish Saint Augustine, which is the first permanent colony and on Turtle Island, to use the indigenous term. It's currently still a city down in Florida. And so what we're seeing here is that the enslaved people do feel like there might be better treatment under the Spanish system as they're heading down that way. Or perhaps they want to overtake that area as well, right? In any case, south is the way that they turn. They burned houses and killed white people. White colonists attacked the rebels near the Edisto River. Most of the rebels were killed, and their survivors were sold into slavery in the West Indies. The rebellion was led by a man named Jemmy, an Angolan man, along with 60 other rebels. The white community then pursued the rebels, killing many of them, like as I just said. And the heads of some rebels were placed on pikes to warn other slaves not to rebel. That placing of heads on pikes is something that goes back to the colonization of the Irish. So it's a practice that is brought here to this continent. It's used up in the Massachusetts Bay Colony from early on as well in the 1600s to scare native peoples up there. And it's of course brutal. And then eventually, and there are different kinds of takes on this. It eventually becomes scalping because it's like, if you're carrying around like heads that weigh about 15 pounds each, right? Like that's really hard to go get bounties on heads. So it becomes the phenomenon of scalping in some form of another exists worldwide, but the way it becomes part of the bounty system or people scalping and then people trading in scalps for money is something that emerges out of what the English colonial system sort of brings to um, uh, uh, this continent. And some people made lots of money doing that sort of thing. So it would be a whole other lecture on the phenomenon of scalping, and then um, uh, you needed the scalp instead of just cutting the hair because the hair wasn't enough for proof, blah blah blah, that kind of stuff. Virginia, coming to Virginia's slave codes, they were made in parallel to those in Barbados, as I said earlier, with individual laws starting in 1667 and a comprehensive slave code passed in 1705. In 1667, the Virginia House of Burgesses enacted a law which did not recognize the conversion of African Americans to Christianity, as I said earlier. 1669, Virginia enacts an act about the casual killing of slaves, which declared that masters who killed slaves deemed resisting were exempt from felony charges. That's a lesser version of the war, or just war kind of thinking that comes along with Doctrine of Discovery, just applied at the individual level. 1670, they enacted a law prohibiting free African Americans from purchasing servants who were not also African. Hmm. This is something that my US students really need to know. Like, why do they need to have a law prohibiting free Africans from purchasing servants who weren't also African? Well, first of all, because there were free Africans, they weren't all enslaved. Um, and Africans had owned bond servants. And what we are seeing is the shift away from bond servitude and indentured servitude into a racialized view that excludes people of a particular race, here African, from having the same kinds of civil liberties as white people. That's why in 1680 there is um, uh, that uh, it makes it illegal for whites and blacks to intermarry or whites to mix with any other race. And then we see Virginia passing an act which prohibits slaves from carrying weapons, leaving their owner's plantation without a certificate or raising a hand against Christians. Earlier on, the process for bonds persons and slaves was that they would be conscripted into armies and militias. They would receive military training so that they could defend. Uh, the colony against native peoples, especially, right? So it might sound weird to people from a 21st century position that like people would train slaves how to fight, but those slaves are the people who end up becoming the peons or the foot soldiers, who are then out fighting any kind of group that might threaten the colony. The international, I mean, we can see that today, right? Like you can see that in the way that large militaries prey on people from precarious backgrounds and and give them a path into a military formation, and then those people end up being the people who are doing the difficult work of going to foreign wars and things like that, right? Um, the international angle. This is something we want to think about that I feel like is so hard on university campuses to think about, but it's so necessary. So first of all, there are religious wars among European nations that affect the emergence of the slave codes. It is religious conflict first before modern race. Papal bulls and the laws of the Indies set the stage for international law between Christian nations, but only between Christian nations at that point in history. Like later on, of course, we get uh, a more secularized version of that, but not during the 1600s. The English Civil War and restoration of the crown in 1660 have ripple effects in the colonies. The Puritans had taken over the English government. The wars emergent in the 1640s, we see the execution of Charles I and the Puritans basically occupying Parliament during the 1650s with the restoration of the crown in 1660, right? It is the restoration of a Protestant crown at first, but the restoration of the Anglican Church is going to be less extreme than the Puritans, the Protestantism of the Puritans who'd been in power. Pop back over to Turtle Island, and what we see is up near the Massachusetts Bay Colony, we see the Pequot War from 1636 to 1638, which uses just war theory from Catholic canon law and the Doctrine of Discovery. They use just war theory against the Massachusetts colonists. Later on in the 1670s, when we could go have multiple lectures on all of this sort of stuff, but I'm not going to do it today, we have Bacon's Rebellion, in which poor whites and blacks get together and have an uprising because of the treatment of indentured servants and slaves. And from that, the reaction to that is to create more racialized laws that separate poor white people from poor black people. Um, and so that racial status and hierarchy um, prevents the lower classes from having uprisings, right? So that's why we see, first religion, then we get this emergent forms of race, and then we see the racial hierarchy being put into place. King Philip's War, or Metacom's War, I mentioned earlier already, was being set up in the same sort of way of like, we will convert some native people to Christianity, then we will trust them, we might train them to give them guns, we'll use them to inform on the goings on of native peoples who are further west into the woods. They will sometimes use the conversion of some native peoples to make land claims further west in the woods as well. Um, and then eventually, more and more, we get this kind of racialized distinction between Indian and uh, white person, instead of that kind of more murky division between who's a converted Indian, are they a seriously converted Indian, that kind of stuff by the turn of the century. So if we turn back to the Pequot War of 1636 to 1638, just as one case example here. In May of 1637, there's a massacre near Mystic River that slays about 400 Pequots. The English and Mohegan and Narragansett allies kill all of them, mostly women and children. Only surviving Pequots were men away on a hunting trip. But they're not all gone. The Pequots are not all gone. Nevertheless, the English declare their success to be a sign of their God's providence and declare a thanksgiving after they return home. There are lots of kinds of thanksgivings going on in the earlier part of the 1600s. The Thanksgiving holiday does not become a federal holiday until under Abraham Lincoln, and it is a rhetorical or propaganda device that is used to shift the center of the country's narrative from Virginia to the North. We're seeing that Civil War, right, between North and South. And so by aligning the national narrative up with the Massachusetts Bay Colony, we see a kind of purification rhetoric of uh, um, uh, the United States aligning with the Christian values up there and the abolition movements of slavery and all sorts of other things. But it is not until the Civil War era that we get something like a federal holiday that we call Thanksgiving. There had been a some diaries from the Pilgrim Plantation that had not been published or in any kind of circulation in the New English colonies, but it surfaces in a shop in actually back in England during the 1650s, and it's from those diaries. Um, uh, and it's not Mort's relation, I don't think. I think it's one of the other ones. That we get um, uh, Plymouth plantation, right? I think is the one that surfaces, and then it gets sort of brought back to New England and circulated and published. And from that kind of like rereading of the foundation of the colonies in the 1850s, excuse me, that we see it's like, oh, well, now this is a way that we can reread the sort of foundation and we get sort of the Mayflower compact rhetoric and all of that kind of stuff emergent later on. So it's a story that's made up as a myth to found a particular version of the way that later Americans want the nation to be. In 1638, so there's a massacre of over 400 people. There's a Thanksgiving declared in 1638. There's the Treaty of Hartford, which declares wrongly that peacocks are extinct. They're not all extinct, and some famous ones show up later on. And this happens a lot where like New English colonists will say like and later in termination policies, for example, from the US government, there's this kind of governing impulse to say like, oh, these people don't exist anymore. What happened to them was unfortunate or whatever, but they don't exist, so there's nothing to do about them anymore, right? Roger Williams, early religious figure and colonist on the East Coast, said says that he secured the sachems' consent, so the leaders' consent of different native nations, to build at Providence, now Rhode Island, right? Not by monies or by payment. Monies could not do it. The native people were not interested in selling land for money. They couldn't think of it that way. They couldn't think of land as property. He says rather what was paid was only a gratuity. We just paid them a little bit like a sign of good faith or something, though I choose for better assurance and form to call it a sale. So he makes a kind of exchange and then he calls it a sale, right? So uh, to other English people. So this was happening all the time where there might be some sort of a trade with the native people, and then the English people would say like, "Oh yeah, well, what they traded was their rights for the land," but that wasn't clearly defined in any sort of way. And the exchange with the actual native people is just something that the Euro-Christian colonists agreed on. So such transactions were not one-for-one exchanges of lands for goods, but a mutual pledge to sustain a quote, loving and peaceable neighborhood. That's quoted in Silverman's book, This Land Was Their Land, if you want to look that one up. I thought it's a good book. It's the history of Thanksgiving kind of book. When English gave or traded arms to Indians, they were fined under Plymouth law. In 1663, we see a Wampanoag Bible um, being produced, a translation of the Bible into Wampanoag. We see that Caleb Chishatahemuk is the son of the sachem Nobnokit, sorry, who is the first native graduate of Harvard in 1665. The early colleges like Harvard and Dartmouth, which we think of as private institutions, of course, today, but they are set up and they are funded with the intention of Christianizing native peoples, which is why they're dealing with unpacking all of that kind of history on their campuses today. In 1674, about a third of the Christian Wampanoags could read and write in their own language. Converting natives to make, quote, praying towns was a way to get land use from sachems. So sachems quickly grew wise to this, and not a single one would allow a mission, a Christian mission, to be put in there. So native people are very clearly on that. They see what the Christians are up to in terms of using conversion as a way to take land. Usamekin, who's Metacom's father, or King Philip's father, warns the English not to evangelize against his people. But when he dies in the early 1660s and Metacom comes into becoming a sachem, that's when we see more and more of an incursion from the English colonial settlers because they're taking advantage of the fact that the person that they had the agreement with before has now passed, and so we get these kind of different exchanges and of like people using converted Indians to inform on other goings on, which creates conflict and creates and somebody gets executed, and then that law about this town is responsible for the next town kind of stuff. That like it basically what happens is conflict is orchestrated among Native people. To justify a just war and then the taking of land, and that erupts massively in King Philip's War in the 1670s, and it would take a whole lecture just on that war. So turning back to the Pequot War in 1636 to 38, we see other things happening in context. So in the earlier 1630s, there's a massive smallpox plague that devastates the natives, and that gives the English population, which is surging, because there's the success of the colonies means that there's more Christian, Euro-Christian Puritan folks back in England saying like, "Oh, this is the New Jerusalem. This is the place to go to," right? So they're coming in larger numbers. There's a massive plague. The English people see the plague as a sign of God's providence with all these dying natives, and then they assert more and more control. So the direct cause of the war in 1636 to 38 is Massachusetts insistence, the colony's insistence, that the Pequots extradite tribal members accused of murdering a troublemaking English merchant named John Stone and his crew. So this guy had been making trouble. He was drunk, and eventually the native people execute him. Um, uh, or well, they take him into to custody, right? And then the colony wants him extradited because he's a white person, and the Pequots are like, no. So the Pequot stations then offer compensation for the dead in the form of gifts and land and furs, because that's the way the gift economy would have worked. But you had this criminal, and he needed to be dealt with. But they would not meet the English demand of extraditing anybody. And so, uh, and they couldn't meet the English people without risking their own lives too, because of that, what would sort of happen, the fear was that the English would then take the English people back, prisoners back, and then would execute the Indians anyway. So the English then send, in response to this situation, they send a punitive expedition against all Pequots and Manassas in 1636. The Pequots respond by killing nine residents of Weatherfield, Connecticut, and in April of 1637 captured two girls. And then this brings on the rage that becomes the 400 plus person massacre at Mystic. And so in the wake of that devastation, we see the formal legalization of slavery. So what is important in terms of 25th century, 2025, 21st century scholarship is that what we see throughout the 1600s is more Native Americans are being sold into slavery, and the apparatuses of enslavement are being used to enslave Native peoples who are shipped out of the East Coast. And in the vacuum of that, more African slaves are being brought in. And then the racial codes are sort of built up. And then there's a visible difference between white people and black people, and we get this hierarchy of the races. Three good books from this period, as one is Margaret Ellen Newell, Brethren by Nature, where she traces that even in the early Massachusetts Bay Colony, that the codes come from poor laws over in England. So that's an important aspect to this conversation I'm not diving deeply into. And those poor laws end up transmorphing into the slave codes. We have missionary conquest, the gospel, and Native American cultural genocide by my colleague Tink Tinker. And then on that disease thing, so the English know that disease, they don't know how inoculation works quite yet, but they know that disease kills people, and that's been being used since the um, Mongolians actually kind of introduced that kind of stuff. So that's been part of warfare for a long time. There had been in the 1580s or 1590s, for example, in England, they had been a quarantine because the plague was going around. So people knew about like isolation when something breaks out. Um, uh, and then later on we get the in the early 1760s we get that really famous example of the smallpox infested blankets being distributed during Pontiac's War. It's just a later thing than this discussion. But tracing that whole sort of disease um, uh, uh, issue, which sometimes like Euro-Christians want to say, oh, it was just disease. They didn't know what was going on. And like, it's unfortunate that all these native people died, but it really wasn't the Euro-Christians' fault. No, there is, when we look back historically, we see that there's a lot of intentionality going on, even if there isn't a full scientific understanding of how works in terms of curing or inoculation. They know enough about hygiene for sure, and how close proximity of contact can spread things. They know about that early on, just as they know that the early colonists are walking into not um, a dense forest, but they're walking into villages and occupying spaces where a plague had if we're thinking about the Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth colony, for example, right? They come in to empty in winter to a village that had faced a, a massive disease. We don't know if it was smallpox or what in the 16 teens that made them vacate, the native people vacate that particular part. And it was being avoided by other Wampanoag folks out of respect. So there's a whole bunch of context to that early 1620, 1621 kind of context as well that I'm just not going to go into in depth in this lecture. I want to take a more in-depth look at Massachusetts Body of Liberties as one example, partly because it's the one that it's the context where slavery first becomes legalized on this continent. Um, there are somewhat ambiguous attitudes about poor laws, indentured servitude, bonds, personship. They get formalized in the 1641 Massachusetts Body of Liberties. Um, And it's important to note, I say, however, that the New England governor, John Winthrop, was already selling Indian slaves into the Atlantic slave trade by 1637, but before that as well. So, so the slave trade existed, right? People were still selling native peoples. but it just increases a lot after the Pequot War. And then the laws sort of are developing about like because like any English person, like say you go capture a native person and you need money, and so you go sell that. Like the next time a ship comes in, you sell native people into to the ship's captain, and then you take your own money, right? So it ends up being part of the codification process is also controlling the commerce of the slave trade itself here. Um, when we look back, we see that the situation of the Pequot War falls under the category of just war as justified by the inclusion of the doctrine of discovery and domination, and that is included in the New England Charter, right? So this is my last lecture on my Patreon page, shows how the language from the doctrine of discovery, the papal bulls, which are Catholic, still inform the Protestant New England charters, right? That's like the Euro-Christian basis underscores or underwrites what becomes international law. We can trace it back further in language that eerily resonates the 1215 Fourth Lateran's Council. There's an attempt to control various peoples. Later on, it becomes that kind of, in Virginia, it becomes the controlling of interracial marriage, right? But we see um, that if you read the 1215 Fourth Lateran Council, you will see that it's during that particular moment that baptismal records are demanded to be kept and marriage records are being kept. And it's meant to prevent marriage between Christians and Muslims or marriage between Christians and Jews. So another part of the Fourth Lateran Council says that Jews and Muslims must wear something that signifies them as being different from Christians. And so that's where we get like Jewish hats and things like this. The caricature of of dress codes in a certain way that later on become the underwritten basis for Nazis making Jewish people wear a yellow star. It comes from Christian law in 1215. So I'm jumping into Statute 89 from the um, Massachusetts Bodies of Liberties. Um, If any nation of other people of other nations professing the true Christian religion shall flee from the tyranny or oppression of their persecutors, or from famine, wars, or the like necessary and compulsory cause, they shall be entertained and succored amongst us according to that power and prudence that God shall give us. So we will protect people who come to us if they're fleeing tyranny or if they want to convert. There shall be any, there shall never be any bond slavery, villanage, or captivity amongst us, Euro-Christians, unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly belie themselves are sold to us. And these shall have all the liberties and Christian uses that which the law of God established in Israel concerning such persons doeth morally require. This exempts none from the servitude who shall be judged thereto by authority. So there's the earlier version of that 1662 law about or sorry, 1667 law about Africans converting to Christianity. This is basically saying that um, uh, claims to religion and claims to sanctuary doesn't exclude people from being in servitude, and they will be judged by the authorities there. It would be really interesting to compare this stuff back to Leviticus too, in the Hebrew Bible, but I can't go there in this lecture. Maintaining freedom of movement depended on professing Christian faith. This is perhaps fittingly followed by two statutes of on the treatment of brutes. So then so that's from 92 to 93. But then in statute 94 we get quote, if any man after legal conviction shall have or worship any other god but the Lord God, he shall be put to death. If any man or woman be a witch, that is, hath consulteth with a familiar spirit, they shall be put to death. 3. If any person shall blaspheme the name of God the Father, Son, or the Holy Ghost with direct, express, presumptuous, or high-handed blasphemy, or shall curse God in the like manner, he shall be put to death. And what ended up happening in context a lot of times, especially with native folks, was that they would like talk back in church, and that would be justification for enslavement and deportation, right? Um, also it would mean that a lot of times that native people would convert in name only because like if I don't convert, I'm going to risk being enslaved or being deported in terms of that sort of thing. Conversion cannot be thought of in terms of some sort of something that people are doing in terms of their free will at that particular moment. So all of this is to come back to like the main points is that like throughout the 1600s, as more and more scholars, and Margaret Ellen Newell is a really good one of them, uh, we are seeing that it is, of course, the religious distinction, the othering that between non Christians, whether Native American or whether African, that establishes the first othering and the first laws, and then more and more as time goes by, and as we get converts from those communities, we see laws that are kind of adapting to those conversions and also formulating notions of race and racial hierarchy, where the word white increasingly replaces the word Christian. And that really, really takes off around or just a little bit after the turn to the 18th century. So right around the shift to the year 1700, we see that emergent sort of a racialized form. And that will keep changing because there are no biological conceptions of race, even though people might talk about blood during this particular time period. They don't think of blood in terms of cells or anything like that. The cell doesn't get discovered until the mid 1800s. And it's during that context and after Darwin and all that that we get this kind of these kind of biological pseudoscience that's kind of emerging around concepts of race. But I call it pseudoscience from the 2025 perspective, but from the perspective of that time, it was the most cutting edge science. So it was considered to be scientifically correct. And then we get eugenics movements and all of that sort of stuff. This was an in-depth look at the formation of slave codes and slave laws. Thank you for listening or watching whenever or wherever you are. We'll catch up with you on another video. Thanks for uh, tuning into the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. If you have the means and are able to support us on Patreon, that would be really helpful. If you're taking this for a class that you've already paid for at a university, please do not feel like I'm asking you for more money there. Okay, have a good day.